The morning that Birdie Abbott's father dropped dead in the middle of counting cattle, she was the one who had to finish the count, because someone had to, and grief did not pay the bank note that came due on the first of the month. That was the spring of 1878, in the dry hill country of the Texas Panhandle, where the Abbott Ranch sat on 11,000 acres of grama grass and mesquite that her father, Elias Abbott, had bled and bargained for over 20 years. Birdie was 22 years old, unmarried, and known throughout Potter County as a woman who could read a ledger faster than most men could read a menu. She had learned numbers at her mother's knee before her mother died of the fever, and she had learned land and cattle at her father's side because there had been no son to teach, only her, and Elias Abbott had never once treated that as a disappointment. A ranch does not care whether the hand on the reins is a man's or a woman's, he used to tell her. It only cares whether that hand knows what it is doing. Birdie's hand knew what it was doing. She knew the going price of a head of steer in Fort Worth versus Dodge City. She knew how many acres of grass it took to fatten a cow before the fall drive. She knew the interest rate on the loan her father had taken against the north pasture, and she knew, standing at his graveside with her black bonnet ribbons snapping in the wind, that grief would have to wait its turn behind arithmetic. The trouble was that arithmetic alone could not save the Abbott Ranch, and within a month of burying her father, Birdie understood this with the same cold clarity she brought to counting cattle. The note at the Amarillo Bank was for $4,000, and it was due in full by the 1st of October. Her father had borrowed against the land 2 years before, during a drought that killed a third of the herd, and he had been rebuilding ever since, one calving season at a time. He had told Birdie, in the last conversation they ever had about money, that he expected to clear the debt with the fall drive of 1878. Then his heart had stopped in a cattle pen on a Tuesday morning, and the burden of that expectation fell onto his daughter's shoulders like a yoke she had never asked to wear. She had cattle enough if the drive went well. She had grass enough if the summer stayed kind. What she did not have was hands enough, because her father's longtime foreman, a weathered man named Tom Riley, had taken ill with lung trouble that winter and gone to live with his sister in San Antonio, and the 2 hired men who remained were competent, but neither one had the experience to boss a drive of 2,000 head over 400 miles of open country to the railhead at Dodge City. Birdie Abbott sat at her father's roll-top desk on a hot evening in late April, doing sums by lamplight, and admitted to herself what she had been avoiding admitting for 3 weeks. She needed a trail boss. She needed a man who knew cattle and knew the trail and knew how to keep 40 other men in line for 2 months on the open plains, and she needed him before the herd was gathered in June, or there would be no drive at all, and no ranch left to inherit come winter. She had heard of exactly one man in the county who fit that description and was, at present, unemployed. His name was Jasper Lawson, and everyone in Potter County had an opinion about him. Jasper Lawson was 28 years old, and he had been driving cattle since he was 16, starting as a wrangler on the remuda, and working his way up through every job a trail crew offered, until he had bossed 3 drives of his own for the Yellow House outfit over in Randall County. He was, by every account Birdie had gathered, honest, hardworking, and utterly without ambition to own land of his own, which struck her as the strangest thing about him, because in her experience every cowboy dreamed of the day he would stop working another man's cattle and start building his own herd. Jasper Lawson, it seemed, dreamed of nothing but the next drive, the next horse, the next stretch of open sky. He had never married. He owned little beyond his saddle, his horse, and the clothes on his back, and he had a reputation, whispered about by the ranch wives of the county, for being too handsome for his own good and entirely too careless with the hearts he left scattered behind him at dances and church socials from Amarillo to Mobetty. None of that mattered to Birdie Abbott. What mattered was that he knew the trail to Dodge City better than any man alive who was not already employed elsewhere, and she needed him. She found him 3 days later at the Yellow House headquarters, where he had just finished helping brand a batch of spring calves and was washing the dust from his face and neck at a horse trough, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and his dark hair damp with sweat and water. Birdie rode up on her father's old bay gelding, dismounted without waiting for anyone to offer assistance, and walked directly toward him with the businesslike stride of a woman who had come to discuss a contract, not a courtship. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "I am told you are between employment." He turned, water still dripping from his jaw, and looked at her with an expression of mild surprise that quickly settled into something more careful, more assessing. He was a tall man, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent their lives in a saddle rather than behind a plow, with a face that was handsome in a sun-worn, unpolished sort of way, weathered brown from years under the Texas sky, with pale creases at the corners of his eyes where he had squinted into 1,000 sunrises. "I am, ma'am," he said, "between things as you say, and you would be Miss Abbott, Elias Abbott's girl." "I am Elias Abbott's daughter, yes, and since his passing I am also the owner of the Abbott Ranch, such as it presently stands." She kept her voice level. She had practiced this speech on the ride over. "I have 2,000 head of cattle that need to reach the railhead at Dodge City before winter, and a note at the bank that needs paying before the 1st of October. I need a trail boss who can get that herd there without losing half of it to stampede, storm, or bad water, and I am told you are the best man in this county for the job." Jasper Lawson wiped his face with a bandana and studied her for a long moment, and Birdie had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being weighed on some scale she could not see the numbers of. "That is a fair piece of praise," he said finally, "and I would not want to disappoint whoever gave it to you. What are you offering, Miss Abbott?" $60 a month, which is $10 above the going rate for a trail boss, plus a bonus of $200 if the herd arrives at Dodge City with losses under 5%. She had worked the figures carefully. It was more than she could comfortably spare, but a ranch with no herd delivered was a ranch with no future at all, so the calculation was simple. You would have full authority over the hiring of the crew and the management of the drive. I would ask only that you report to me on matters of significant expense, and that you understand the herd belongs to me, not to you. Something flickered across his face that might have been amusement. "You have thought this through." "I have had little else to think about, Mr. Lawson." He was quiet a moment, looking past her toward the flat horizon where heat shimmered above the grass. "I am sorry for your father," he said, and it did not sound like a formality. "He was a fair man, sold me a good horse once and did not try to cheat me on the price, which is more than I can say for most ranchers in this county." "Thank you," Birdie said, and found unexpectedly that her throat had tightened. She swallowed it down. Grief had no place in a business negotiation. "Will you take the job, Mr. Lawson?" He looked at her a moment longer, and there was something in his gaze that she could not quite categorize, something that made her feel, for one disorienting second, as though he were seeing not the ledger sheets and the calving numbers she carried in her head, but her, Birdie herself, in a way that few men had ever bothered to look. "I will," he said, "on one condition." "Name it." "That you ride with the drive." Birdie blinked. "I beg your pardon. You heard me correctly, Miss Abbott. 2 months on the trail, a green crew, a herd that size, and a banknote hanging over the whole business. I would want the owner where I can consult her, not sitting at a desk 400 miles away wondering if I am running her ranch into the ground. You know your cattle and your numbers. I will need that out there when things go wrong, because things always go wrong on a drive." He paused. "Besides which, ma'am, if I am going to be trusted with your father's life's work, I would rather you saw with your own eyes that I did right by it." It was, Birdie had to admit, not an unreasonable request, and there was a note of respect buried in it that she had not expected from a man of his reputation. Most men she had dealt with since her father's death had spoken to her in the soft, patient tone reserved for children or the slightly simple, as though her grasp of numbers were a parlor trick rather than a genuine competence. Jasper Lawson had not done that. He had negotiated with her as he would have negotiated with any rancher, man or woman, and something in Birdie's chest loosened slightly at the novelty of it. "Very well," she said. "I will ride with the drive. Then we have an agreement, Miss Abbott." He extended his hand, and she shook it, noting the calluses across his palm, the strength in his grip that he did not use to overpower hers, only to seal the bargain plainly, honestly. "We do, Mr. Lawson," she said, and told herself firmly that the warmth spreading up her arm from that handshake was nothing more than the Texas sun, and certainly nothing worth calculating. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. Jasper hired a crew of 14 men, mostly young cowboys looking for trail wages, along with a cook named Ezra Combs who had made the run to Dodge City 3 times before and knew how to stretch a chuck wagon's supplies over 60 days of hard travel. Birdie oversaw the gathering of the herd from the far pastures, working alongside her 2 hired men, and the new crew to sort and count and brand, until her hands were raw and her back ached in a way she had not felt since she was a girl helping her father through calving season. She watched Jasper Lawson work during those weeks, and despite herself, she found herself impressed. He was patient with green hands and firm with lazy ones. He knew every water hole and stretch of good grass between the Abbott Ranch and the Red River crossing, and beyond it clear to the Kansas line, having ridden that route 3 times before for other outfits. He treated his horses with a gentleness that surprised her, murmuring to a nervous colt in a low voice until it settled beneath his hand, and she began to understand why men followed him without question, why the ranch wives whispered about him not merely for his handsome face, but for something steadier beneath it, some quality of quiet competence that made a person trust him before they quite meant to. She told herself this was simply useful information, the sort of thing a practical woman noted about the man to whom she had entrusted her father's herd and her family's future. She told herself that the way her pulse quickened when he rode past her, tipping his hat with that half-smile of his, was nothing more than the ordinary response of a woman aware of a handsome man's presence, easily managed, easily set aside. She told herself a great many things that spring, and most of them, she would later admit, were lies. The herd moved out on the 15th of June, 2,040 head of Texas longhorn cattle strung out across the prairie in a column nearly 2 miles long, dust rising behind them in a great brown cloud that could be seen for miles. Birdie rode near the front of the drive on her father's bay gelding, a mare of her own having proven too skittish for the noise and chaos of a herd that size, and Jasper Lawson rode the point position, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble, weather, or water. The first 2 weeks passed with the ordinary difficulties of any drive a few cattle that strayed and had to be chased back into the herd. A young cowboy named Charlie Prout who got thrown from his horse and broke no bones but bruised his pride considerably. A sudden summer storm that sent thunder rolling across the plains and required every hand in the outfit to ride circles around the herd all night to keep 2,000 frightened longhorns from bolting into a stampede that would have scattered them across 3 counties. It was during that storm that Birdie first understood, with the same clarity she brought to a column of figures, that her calculations regarding Jasper Lawson had failed her completely. She had ridden out with the other hands to help hold the herd, her slicker soaked through within minutes, lightning splitting the black sky in jagged white cracks that illuminated 2,000 pairs of wild eyes and lowered horns. The cattle were bawling, shifting, ready to run, and it took every rider in the outfit singing low, steady songs and riding the perimeter to keep them from breaking. Birdie's gelding was frightened, dancing sideways, and for one heart-stopping moment she thought she would be thrown directly into the path of the herd. Then Jasper Lawson was there, materializing out of the rain and dark like something conjured, his hand closing around her gelding's bridle to steady the animal, his voice low and calm even as thunder cracked overhead. "Easy now, easy. You are all right, Miss Abbott. Just hold steady and sing with me. They do not like the quiet as much as they fear the noise. And so, absurdly, in the middle of a lightning storm with 2,000 cattle threatening to run her down, Birdie Abbott found herself singing an old hymn her mother used to sing, her voice shaking, while Jasper Lawson rode beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the rain, his own low baritone joining hers, and something in her chest cracked open that had nothing to do with fear of the storm at all. By dawn the herd had settled, exhausted but unbroken, and the crew counted heads to find they had lost only 6 to straying in the night, a remarkably small number for a storm of that violence. Birdie sat on a wet log near the chuck wagon, wrapped in a blanket Ezra Combs had pressed into her hands, drinking scalding coffee and trying to still the tremor that had not entirely left her from the night's fear. And Jasper Lawson came and sat beside her, his own hair plastered flat with rain, exhaustion carved into the lines of his face. "You did well out there," he said. "Most owners I have worked for would have stayed safe in the wagon and let the hired hands take the risk." "My father did not raise me to hide from risk, Mr. Lawson." She wrapped her hands tighter around the tin cup. "He raised me to face whatever the ranch required." "He raised you well then." Jasper looked at her, and in the gray light of dawn, with the storm's violence spent and the whole crew quiet with fatigue around them, there was something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen before. "I do not say that lightly, Miss Abbott. I have known a good many ranchers, men who inherited land and thought that was the whole of the work. You are the first I have met who understood that land is not a possession. It is a responsibility." Birdie felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the coffee. "That is kind of you to say." "It is not kindness. It is only the truth as I see it." He looked away, out toward the herd, and something in his jaw tightened, as though he had said more than he intended. "Get some rest if you can. We will push on by midday." He rose and walked away toward his own bedroll, and Birdie sat watching him go, feeling the strange new ache in her chest that she could not name, could not calculate, could not fit into any column of a ledger, no matter how she tried. The weeks that followed brought the drive across the Red River, a crossing that took 2 full days of careful management to avoid drowning cattle in the swollen current, and then north through the Indian Territory, where Birdie saw for the first time the wide sweep of land held by the Kiowa and Comanche and Cheyenne peoples, land the government had promised them in treaties that were, as her father had once bitterly remarked, written in sand rather than stone. She saw the poverty forced upon communities that had once ranged freely across the whole of the southern plains, penned now onto reservations far smaller than the territory their ancestors had known, and something in her recognized an injustice too large for her own troubles to eclipse. Jasper Lawson, she noticed, treated every person they encountered on the trail, whatever their origin, with the same plain courtesy he extended to his own crew. When a small group of Cheyenne men rode up to the drive one afternoon to request, as was custom, and often demanded a toll of cattle for herds crossing through what remained of their traditional lands, Jasper did not bluster or reach for his rifle as some trail bosses were known to do. He negotiated calmly, offering 2 lame steers that would have slowed the drive regardless, and the exchange passed without incident, the Cheyenne men riding off with a nod of thanks that Jasper returned in kind. "You did not have to give them anything," one of the younger hands muttered afterward, a boy named Silas who had joined the drive at Charlie Pruitt's recommendation. "Cattle's ours." "The land was theirs first, Silas, whatever the government says about it now," Jasper answered, not unkindly but with a firmness that closed the subject. A man who cannot spare 2 lame steers to keep peace on a 100-mile stretch of trail is not thinking clearly about his own interests, let alone what is fair. "We will not speak of this again." Birdie, overhearing this exchange from where she sat mending a torn cinch strap, found her estimation of Jasper Lawson climbing yet another notch, and told herself sternly that admiration for a man's character was a perfectly reasonable, practical thing to feel, and did not need to feel so much like the beginning of something far less reasonable. It was near the Cimarron River crossing, some 5 weeks into the drive, that the real crisis came, the one that would test everything Birdie thought she knew about calculation, about risk, about what could and could not be managed with careful planning. They had pushed the herd hard for 3 days across a stretch of dry country with poor grass, hurrying to reach the river before their water supply ran too low, when a band of riders appeared on the horizon at dusk. 6 men on tired horses who approached the camp with the loose, deliberate swagger of men looking for easy trouble. Ezra Combs, who had seen every manner of drifter and outlaw in his years cooking for trail crews, took one look and murmured to Birdie that these were not honest men looking for supper. Jasper Lawson met them at the edge of the firelight, his rifle held loose but ready in the crook of his arm, and Birdie watched from the shadow of the chuck wagon with her heart hammering as the leader of the group. A thick-necked man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow demanded to know how many head the outfit was driving and where the money from the sale was to be banked. "That is my business and none of yours," Jasper said evenly. "You are welcome to share our fire and our coffee if you are hungry, but I will ask you to move on come morning. We do not need trouble, and I do not believe you want the kind of trouble 14 armed cowhands can offer." The scarred man's eyes flicked past Jasper to where Birdie stood, and something ugly crossed his face. "That the owner? Pretty thing to be out on the trail alone." "She is not alone," Jasper said, and his voice had gone hard and flat in a way Birdie had not heard from him before, a warning wrapped around every syllable. "She has 14 men who would each put a bullet in you before you cleared leather, myself first among them. I will say it once more plainly so there is no confusion. Take your supper if you want it. Move on by morning. Do not look at her again." The tension stretched taut as a wire for a long moment, the whole camp gone silent, every hand's fingers resting near a holster, and then the scarred man laughed, a short, ugly sound, and spat into the dirt. "No trouble tonight, boss man," he said, mocking. "We will just be moving along." They rode off into the dark without taking the offered coffee, and it was another hour before the crew's tension eased enough for anyone to return to ordinary conversation, though every man kept his rifle close that night, and Jasper doubled the watch around both the herd and the camp itself. Birdie found him later, sitting apart from the fire, cleaning his rifle with the careful, repetitive motion of a man working off nervous energy. She approached and sat beside him without asking permission, something she would not have done a month before. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For what you said to that man, and for meaning it." Jasper set down the rifle and looked at her, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, the dark of his eyes. "I would have said the same for any woman under my charge, Miss Abbott. You need not thank me for that." "I do not believe that is entirely true," Birdie said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I do not believe you would have gone quite so still and quite so dangerous for just any woman." Something shifted in his expression, a wariness sliding into something else, something that made her breath catch. "Miss Abbott, Birdie," she said. "You may call me Birdie. I think we have gone through enough together on this trail that Miss Abbott has begun to sound absurd between us." A slow smile spread across his face, the first true, unguarded smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his whole countenance from merely handsome to something that made her chest ache. "Birdie, then, and you may call me Jasper if you like the sound of it better than Mr. Lawson." "I believe I do," she said, and the words came out softer than she intended, more of a confession than she meant to make. They sat together by the small fire for a long while after that, not talking of cattle or ledgers or the bank note waiting in Amarillo, but of smaller things, of Jasper's childhood on a failed farm in East Texas, of the older brother he had lost to a fever the same year their father lost the farm to debt, of how he had drifted west at 16 with nothing but a horse and a determination never again to watch land he loved slip away through no fault of his own labor. Birdie understood, hearing this, why he had never sought to own land of his own, why the freedom of the open trail appealed to a man who had once watched everything solid in his life crumble away. She told him, in turn, of her mother's death when she was 12, of learning arithmetic at the kitchen table by lamplight, because her father believed a woman who understood numbers could never be cheated by any man, banker or rancher or otherwise. She told him of the loneliness of being the only child on a ranch of that size, of the suitors who had come calling over the years and left disappointed when they realized she was more interested in the price of beef than in the price of her own hand. They wanted a wife who would defer to them, Jasper said, not quite a question. They wanted a wife who would not know enough to notice if they were managing her poorly, Birdie corrected. I could not abide the thought of handing over everything my father built to a man who would run it into the ground through ignorance or carelessness, however charming his manners. And what would you require in a husband if such a man existed? Jasper asked, and there was something careful in his voice, something that told her the question mattered to him beyond idle curiosity. Birdie considered this seriously, turning the question over as she might turn over a column of figures, looking for the sum. I would require honesty, she said slowly, and competence in whatever work occupied him, and she hesitated. And I believe I would require that he see me as a partner in the ranch's fortunes, not merely as its ornament. A man who could sit across a ledger from me and add value to the sum, not merely take from it. That is a rare thing to ask for, Jasper said quietly. I am aware. She looked at him, and the firelight made shadows dance across his face, and she felt with sudden and unwelcome clarity that she had just described, without meaning to, the very man sitting beside her. I have found it entirely impossible to calculate, so far. Jasper's dark eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither was yet brave enough to name aloud. And then a call from one of the night riders broke the spell, some minor commotion among the herd that required his attention, and he rose, offering her a hand to help her up as well, though she did not strictly need it. "Good night, Birdie," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something precious. "Good night, Jasper," she answered, and watched him walk away into the dark toward the herd, feeling something in her chest that no arithmetic in the world could explain away. The drive continued north through the remainder of July and into August, crossing the Cimarron without further incident, pushing through the sandy stretches of the Indian Territory toward the Kansas line. Birdie found herself, in the weeks that followed that night by the fire, increasingly unable to maintain the careful distance she had intended to keep between herself and her trail boss. They fell into an easy habit of riding together in the evenings after the herd was bedded down, discussing the day's progress, the state of the grass ahead, the water sources marked on Jasper's much-folded map. But always, beneath the practical conversation, there ran a current of something else, something that made her acutely aware of the space between his hand and hers when they rode side by side, of the low warmth in his voice when he said her name. She caught herself, more than once, watching him work the herd with an admiration that had stopped being purely practical weeks before. She watched the easy strength in his shoulders as he roped a straying steer, the patience in his hands as he calmed a spooked horse, the quiet authority with which he settled disputes among the younger hands without ever raising his voice. She had spent her whole life calculating value, weighing cost against benefit, and she found, to her own considerable dismay, that she could not perform that calculation where Jasper Lawson was concerned. There was no column into which his worth could be entered, no sum that captured what she felt when he looked at her across a campfire. It frightened her, this inability to calculate, more than the storm had frightened her, more than the outlaws at the Cimarron crossing had frightened her. She had built her entire understanding of herself around the idea that she was a practical woman, a woman who did not lose her head over a handsome face or a charming manner. And yet here she was, 22 years old and 400 miles from home, entirely undone by a cowboy with nothing to his name but a good horse and a reputation for breaking hearts he had never meant to keep. She tried, for a time, to reason herself out of it. She reminded herself of everything she had heard about Jasper Lawson before she ever met him. The dances where he had danced with every girl in the county and married none of them. The reputation for restlessness that had followed him from one outfit to another. She told herself that a man who had never wanted land of his own would never be content as a husband to a woman whose entire life was bound up in acreage and cattle counts and banknotes. She told herself that whatever she felt for him was a foolishness born of gratitude and proximity, the natural result of 2 months spent depending on each other under difficult circumstances, and that it would fade once the drive was complete and ordinary life resumed. She told herself all of this, and none of it made the smallest difference to the way her heart lifted every time she saw him ride toward her across the plain. It was near the end of August, with the herd only a week's drive from Dodge City, that matters came to a head in a manner Birdie had not anticipated and could not have calculated for. They had stopped for a rest day beside a good stretch of river, the cattle grazing contentedly on tall grass after weeks of leaner country, and Birdie had walked apart from the camp toward a stand of cottonwood trees along the water, seeking a moment of solitude to think through the numbers she would need once they reached the railhead, the price per head she hoped to negotiate with the buyers, the amount that would clear the bank note, the amount, if any, that might remain to invest in rebuilding the herd for next year. She was so absorbed in these calculations that she did not hear Jasper approach until he was nearly beside her. "Thinking about the sale?" he asked. "Always," she admitted with a small, rueful smile. "It is a habit I cannot break. My father used to say I would calculate profit and loss in my sleep if I could. And what does the calculation tell you? Will the ranch be saved?" Birdie considered the question seriously, running the numbers once more in her head. "If the market price holds and we do not lose more than another handful of head between here and Dodge City, yes. We will clear the note with perhaps $300 to spare, which is not much, but it is enough to see us through the winter and buy breeding stock for next spring." "That is good news, then." Jasper's voice was warm with genuine pleasure at this. "Your father would be proud, Birdie. Not many outfits could have pulled off a drive like this one with so few losses, and fewer still with an owner who understood every figure of it as well as her trail boss did. I could not have done it without you," she said honestly. "I want you to know that, Jasper. Whatever happens after Dodge City, I will always know that you are the reason this ranch survives." Something in his face shifted at this, a seriousness replacing the easy warmth of a moment before. "What do you mean, whatever happens after Dodge City?" Birdie looked away, out toward the river, feeling suddenly exposed. "I mean that once the cattle are sold and the men are paid off, the drive will be finished, and you will move on to whatever outfit needs a trail boss next season, and I will return to the ranch." And she stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to say aloud the fear that had been growing in her for weeks, that this strange, precious interlude between them would end as soon as their business arrangement concluded, that a man like Jasper Lawson, who had never wanted land of his own, would never choose to stay tied to a woman whose whole life was bound up in acreage and cattle. "Is that what you want?" Jasper asked quietly. "For me to move on?" "No," she said before she could stop herself, the word escaping in a rush of honesty she had not intended to allow herself. "No, that is not what I want at all, and I have spent 2 months trying to calculate a way to want something more sensible, and I have failed completely." Jasper stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "Birdie," he said, her name rough in his throat. "I have spent this whole drive telling myself the same thing. That a woman like you, with a ranch and a fortune in cattle and a mind sharper than any man I have ever met, would have no use for a drifter like me once the herd was sold. That I was a fool to let myself feel what I have been feeling since that first night in the storm, when you sang beside me with your voice shaking and your hands steady on the reins anyway." "And what have you been feeling?" Birdie asked, barely above a whisper. That I have never in my life met a woman I wanted to stop drifting for until you, he said. That I have spent 12 years running from the idea of putting down roots because I watched my father lose everything to bad debt and bad luck, and I swore I would never again care enough about a piece of ground to have my heart broken by it. But it is not the ground I am afraid of losing any more, Birdie. It is you, and I do not know how to calculate my way out of that either. Birdie felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, tears she had not shed even at her father's funeral, tears that came now because some vast weight of uncertainty she had been carrying for weeks suddenly broke apart under the plain honesty of his words. "I do not want you to calculate your way out of it," she said. "I want you to stay, not as my trail boss drawing wages for a season and moving on. I want," she swallowed hard, gathering her courage, "I want you to consider staying at the Abbott Ranch, as a partner, as my foreman if that is all you can offer, but I hope you might consider offering more than that." Jasper's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing gently along her cheekbone, and Birdie leaned into the touch without hesitation. All her careful practicality dissolved into something far simpler and far more true. "Birdie Abbott," he said, "are you asking me to marry you?" A startled laugh broke from her, half tears and half joy. "I believe I am making rather a poor job of it if so. I have never proposed marriage before. I am not certain of the proper procedure." "I believe the proper procedure," Jasper said, and now he was smiling, that unguarded smile that had undone her weeks before beside the fire, "involves the man doing the asking. So allow me to correct the arithmetic if you will permit it. Birdie Abbott, I have fallen in love with you somewhere between the Red River and this cottonwood grove, though I could not tell you the precise mile marker if my life depended on it. I do not have land, and I do not have much money beyond my wages, and I cannot offer you the kind of security a woman as capable as you deserves. But I can offer you a partner who will never underestimate you, who will never ask you to be less than exactly what you are, and who will love you faithfully every day for the rest of his life if you will have him. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Birdie said, the word coming out on a breath of pure relief and happiness, no calculation required at all. "Yes, Jasper, I will marry you, and I do not care in the least that you have no land, because I have land enough for the both of us, and what I need is not more acreage but a man who will stand beside me on it, and I have found that man, entirely against my own careful planning." He kissed her then, beneath the cottonwood trees beside the river, with the herd grazing peacefully in the distance, and the whole vast Kansas sky turning gold and rose with the setting sun. And Birdie Abbott, who had spent her whole life calculating value and weighing cost against return, understood at last that some things could not be measured, only felt, and that the feeling flooding through her now, warm and certain and entirely unbidden, was worth more than every acre her father had ever owned. They did not tell the crew immediately, both of them wanting to hold the moment private a little longer, but Ezra Combs, who had cooked for enough trail crews to recognize the signs, took one look at the pair of them returning to camp hand in hand and grinning like fools, and announced to the assembled hands that he would be baking a wedding cake as soon as they reached a town with proper supplies, which drew a round of laughter and good-natured ribbing from the younger cowboys, several of whom had apparently placed private wagers weeks before on whether their trail boss and the boss lady would end up married by the time they reached Dodge City. "I had my money on before the Cimarron crossing," Silas admitted cheerfully, to Jasper's mock outrage, "on account of the way you looked at her during that storm, like she'd hung the moon herself." The remainder of the drive passed in a haze of happiness that Birdie would remember for the rest of her life as one of the sweetest stretches of time she ever knew, even amid the hard work of pushing the herd those final miles to Dodge City. They reached the railhead on the 3rd of September, having lost only 31 head across the entire 400-mile drive, a result so far better than average that word of it spread quickly among the cattle buyers gathered at the stockyards, and Birdie found herself in the unusual position of having buyers competing for the privilege of purchasing her herd, which drove the price up several dollars ahead above what she had originally calculated. The sale, when it finally concluded, brought in enough money to clear the bank note entirely, pay off the crew's wages with a generous bonus for every hand who had stayed with the drive from start to finish, and leave a surplus of nearly $800, far more than the $300 Birdie had originally projected. She sat that evening in the small hotel room she had taken in Dodge City, going over the final figures with Jasper beside her, and found herself laughing at the absurdity of it, that she should feel such pure joy over a column of numbers when the true wealth of that season had nothing to do with dollars at all. "You look pleased with yourself," Jasper observed, watching her with the fond, warm expression that had become as familiar to her now as her own reflection. "I am pleased," she said. "The ranch is saved. The note is paid. We have money enough for breeding stock and then some. My father's life's work will continue." She set down her pen and looked at him. "And I am to be married to a man I love beyond all calculation, which I did not think possible for a woman as practical as myself." "Practical women fall in love same as any other kind," Jasper said, drawing her close. "They simply do not expect it, and so it catches them all the harder when it comes." They were married 2 weeks later, once they had returned to Texas, in the small clapboard church outside Amarillo, where Birdie's parents had been married nearly 30 years before. The whole crew from the drive attended, along with most of the ranching families of Potter County, curious to witness the wedding of the woman everyone agreed was the shrewdest rancher in the district, and the cowboy everyone had assumed would never settle down. Ezra Combs made good on his promise of a wedding cake, an elaborate confection that drew admiring comments from every guest, and Sela's and the other young hands presented the couple with a hand-carved wooden box containing a collection of horseshoes they claimed were lucky, gathered from every good horse that had made the drive. Birdie wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and Jasper wore a new suit purchased with part of his bonus wages, looking so unlike his usual trail-worn self that Birdie laughed aloud when she first saw him standing at the altar, and he grinned back at her, entirely unbothered by her amusement, his eyes full of a happiness that matched her own. The preacher who married them was an elderly circuit rider named Reverend Hollis, who had known Birdie's father for 20 years and who spoke, in his wedding address, of the importance of partnership in marriage, of two people building something together that neither could build alone. And Birdie found herself thinking of her father, of how proud he would have been to see his daughter not merely saving the ranch he built, but finding, in the process, a partner who understood its value as deeply as she did herself. "Do you, Birdie Abbott, take this man, Jasper Lawson, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Reverend Hollis asked. "I do," Birdie said, without a moment's hesitation, without a single calculation running through her mind, only certainty. "And do you, Jasper Lawson, take this woman, Birdie Abbott, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jasper said, his voice steady and sure, and when he lifted her veil to kiss her, the whole church erupted in applause and cheering that Birdie felt in her very bones, a happiness so complete it seemed to fill the small building to its rafters. They settled into married life at the Abbott Ranch that autumn, and Birdie discovered, in the months that followed, that everything she had hoped for in a partner had come true in Jasper Lawson beyond even her expectations. He took to ranch management with an ease that surprised even him, applying the same careful attention he had given to trail bossing to the daily work of running a cattle operation, rotating pastures to preserve the grass, negotiating fair wages with the hired hands, breeding careful selections of stock to improve the herd's quality year over year. He never once tried to override Birdie's judgment on matters of money or business, understanding instinctively, as few men of that era did, that her competence in these matters was not a threat to his own authority but an asset to be valued and relied upon. They argued, of course, as any married couple does over whether to invest in a particular parcel of adjoining land that came up for sale the following spring. A decision Birdie initially thought too risky and Jasper argued would pay for itself within 3 years. A disagreement that ended with Birdie running the numbers 6 different ways before finally agreeing that Jasper's instinct, this once, had outpaced her arithmetic, and the purchase proved a sound one within 2 years' time, just as he had predicted. They argued too over smaller things, over whether a particular horse should be broken to saddle or left to run another season, over whether to attend a neighbor's barn dance when both of them were bone-tired from a long week's work. But always these disagreements resolved themselves in laughter and compromise, the natural friction of two strong-willed people learning to build a life together. In the spring of 1880, not quite 2 years after their wedding, Birdie gave birth to their first child, a son they named Elias after her father, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair, and as it turned out over the following years, his mother's sharp mind for figures, which delighted Birdie beyond measure when he began, at the age of 5, to count the ranch's cattle alongside her, insisting with great seriousness that he was helping with the important work. 2 years after Elias came a daughter, whom they named Sarah after Birdie's mother, a bright and stubborn child who grew up just as comfortable on horseback as her older brother, having inherited, it seemed, both her mother's practicality and her father's easy way with animals. The ranch prospered through those years, weathering a difficult drought in 1883 that tested every skill Birdie and Jasper had between them, but which they survived through careful management of water and grass, the same partnership that had carried them safely through the trail drive years before now applied to the daily challenges of ranch life. Jasper never did lose his love of the open trail entirely, and every few years, when the fall drive came around, he would take charge of moving the Abbott cattle to market himself, just as he had that first year, though now he did so as a partner rather than an employee. And Birdie, when the children were old enough to be left with a trusted hand or accompanied along for shorter stretches of the drive, would sometimes ride with him again, remembering with fondness the storm and the fire and the cottonwood grove where everything between them had changed. Tom Riley, the old foreman whose illness had first left Birdie without anyone to boss that fateful drive, eventually recovered enough to return to Texas, and Jasper, remembering the debt of gratitude owed to the man who had trained so many of the county's best hands, offered him a position as an advisor to the ranch, a role Tom filled happily for many years afterward, teaching young Elias Lawson everything he knew about cattle just as he had once taught Birdie's father decades before. By the time their third child arrived, a second son they named Thomas after old Tom Riley, the Abbott Lawson Ranch, as it had come to be known throughout the county, stood as one of the most successful and respected operations in the Panhandle, its success attributed by everyone who knew the family to the remarkable partnership between Birdie and Jasper, her sharp business sense, paired with his deep knowledge of cattle and land. Her careful calculation balanced by his willingness to take the occasional necessary risk, and beneath it all, a love that had grown only stronger through every season of hard work and shared purpose. On a warm evening many years later, when Elias was grown and managing much of the day-to-day ranch work himself, and Sarah had married a good man from a neighboring ranch, and young Thomas was off at school in Amarillo learning skills his parents hoped might one day help the ranch expand even further, Birdie and Jasper sat together on the porch of the house they had built, watching the sun set over land that had been saved all those years before. By a trail drive neither of them could have predicted would change their lives so completely. "Do you ever wonder," Birdie asked, resting her head against her husband's shoulder as the sky turned gold and rose above the horizon, the same colors she often thought as that first evening beneath the cottonwood trees, "what would have happened if you had said no that day at the Yellow House Ranch? If you had turned down the job?" Jasper considered this, his arm tightening around her. "I have thought on it," he admitted. "I do not believe I could have said no even then." I took one look at you riding up on that old bay gelding, talking business like a banker twice your age, and I knew I was in trouble, though it took me a good deal longer to admit what kind of trouble it was. Birdie laughed, the same warm laugh that had first caught his attention all those years before. I calculated everything about that drive, you know. Every mile, every dollar, every risk. I had contingencies planned for storms, for stampedes, for outlaws, for drought. I had thought of everything. Everything except me, Jasper said, smiling down at her. Everything except you, she agreed, tilting her face up to meet his kiss, soft and familiar and no less thrilling for all the years that had passed since their first. You were the one thing I never could calculate, Jasper Lawson, and I am endlessly grateful for it. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had built a life and a family and a legacy from land and cattle and careful planning, but whose deepest happiness had come, in the end, from the one variable no ledger could ever have predicted, a love that had found them both on the open plains of Texas, in the middle of a storm, and had never once let go since. The ranch they built together would pass in time to their children and grandchildren. The Abbott name and the Lawson name joined forever in the deed to that land. But the story the family told most often, around firesides and at gatherings for generations afterward, was not of the acres accumulated or the cattle bred or the fortunes made, but of a practical young woman who had ridden out one spring morning to hire a trail boss, and had found, instead, the love of her life. In a cowboy who had never wanted land of his own until he found a reason worth staying for. And every autumn, when the leaves turned gold along the river where cottonwoods still grew tall and full, Birdie Abbott Lawson would walk that same stretch of ground with her husband beside her, hand in hand, remembering the evening when calculation had failed her utterly, and love, unbidden and unmeasured, had won completely, and would keep on winning for the whole rest of their long and happy lives together.